For more than 36 years, Gary Clyde Hufbauer has done spectacular, innovative work on trade and investment at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. This is Steve Wiseman at the Institute, and it gives me a bittersweet pleasure to welcome Gary to this interview, which is on the occasion of his retirement from the Institute. Gary, welcome.
Thank you.
For your exit interview at the
Thank you.
Institute. Gary, you've been here at the Institute for 36 years, but
Yes.
you've been in the trade biz for more than a half a century.
Well,
How did you get into this line of work?
Well, I had a couple of great professors at Harvard. I guess the one who's best known is Gottfried Haberler, but also Seymour Harris, both in their ways pioneers. And then there are other professors as well, but those were the two international economists that I worked with.
Is this in grad school or
No, it was undergraduate.
undergraduate?
Undergraduate. And they, I learned a lot from them. I got very excited in the subject. I did a senior thesis on balance of payments issues. And then I went off to Cambridge, England, and ran into some other great scholars of the international economy. And that was it.
And then did you join the government after you earned your degree, or did you?
No. I started off at the University of New Mexico as a professor. I wanted to get back to the Southwest. If you spend time in England, you know about the clouds and the rain and so forth. I was anxious to get back to the sun, and that's what I did. And it was a time very easy to get a job, and I chose New Mexico.
And then how did you end up in policy making in Washington?
I did a fairly major consulting assignment with the Treasury in the mid-1960s. And that was recommended by Ray Vernon, another distinguished Harvard Business School professor, and Stan Surrey Law School. And at the time, we had a balance of payments problem, or at least we thought we did.
Right, that was a big deal in the 60s.
It was a big deal. We were losing gold, people were worried, and they wondered how multinational corporations fit into it. And multinational corporations were a very small phenomenon then compared to now.
Today, although Raymond Vernon was a pioneer in studying that.
On the subject. And so I came back and did a consulting assignment with another colleague, Michael Adler, and we looked at the balance of payments and how it was affected by overseas investment. And it was a Treasury policy study, and I think led to some policy restrictions, which I wasn't very happy about, but that was the nature of the day.
And then how did you get into government? That consulting job?
Then I spent a little time as a visiting professor in Cambridge, England, and then I was invited back to head up the tax department in the Treasury on the international side.
I see.
The group of economists who deal with the international side of the tax system, which is pretty complicated. And so I spent several years there. And then when the Carter administration came along, Fred joined the Treasury.
Fred Bergston,
and then he invited me to become a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Trade and Investment.
So now we did a little interview with Fred. Why don't we cut to Fred's assessment of your work there?
Gary Hufbauer is a living legend in the field of trade policy. Already in the 1960s, he came up with definitive analyses of the new problems of the balance of payments, foreign direct investment, and how it affected the U.S. economy. In the 1970s, as a high official in the Treasury Department, he negotiated the subsidy code in the Tokyo round of trade negotiations that was the centerpiece of that effort, made it saleable to the U.S. Congress, and put a whole new governance structure in place for world trade.
So Gary, what was the nature of your work that was so innovative that Fred just talked about?
Well, he probably praised me too much, but I appreciate that. Well, the interesting things we did during the period of the Tokyo round were to try to put some limits on subsidies to international trade. On the one hand, we were reducing the barriers, but everybody recognized that if you reduce the barriers and you don't limit the subsidies, you'll get into another form of distortion.
Right. It's like banning steroids for athletes.
Yeah, and which we're very much into today, the subsidies issue.
Yeah.
But it was recognized back then, and we had a pioneering code which was supposed to limit national subsidies. We had already seen the example of the maritime industry. I don't think it's widely recognized, but every country which has a maritime industry subsidizes it to the high heavens. Very wasteful, very distortive, but maritime is free trade. I mean, that exemplifies free trade. So that's the way the system can go if you don't put some brakes on the subsidy side. The brakes we put on were innovative, but they haven't proven to be strong enough.
Now, after the Carter years, which were very turbulent on the international front, to say the least, oil embargoes, stagflation, and the ongoing problem of balance of payments and national debt, Fred Bergston decided in the early 80s to start the Institute for International Economics. And how quickly did he recruit you to come aboard?
Well, quite quickly, about, I'd say, 6 months afterwards. I was delighted that he came out and formed it. He formed it from nothing, really. Got some very important sponsors, Pete Peterson being the foremost, German Marshall Fund, and started it from scratch, and I was just delighted to join him again. I was over at Georgetown at the International Law Institute there, and was quite happy to come over here to the Peterson Institute. And so I've been here, more or less, as you said, all these years.
Yeah, more or less. Yeah. More than less.
Yeah, well, I took some time to be over at Georgetown as a professor and a time at the Council on Foreign Relations.
Among the many, many significant studies he did at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, in the 1990s, he led the team that came up with the famous big number conclusion. When Secretary of the Treasury, Larry Summers, asked us to come up with a single number to characterize the impact of globalization on the United States, Gary Hufbauer produced that number, about $1 trillion a year of favorable effects, since updated to $2 trillion per year. One more capstone in a remarkable career of a towering figure in the world of international trade, investment, tax policy, and the world economy more broadly.
One of your signature issues that Fred cites is the big number.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, if you studied economics when I did back in the 60s, there was something called the Harburger triangles, which were measures of gains from trade. And triangles tend to be smaller than rectangles, And the gains were measured to be pretty small. It's maybe a good thing to have trade, comparative advantage. Ricardo taught us that. But, when you added it up, it wasn't a very big thing. And that just seemed progressively more out of step with the reality, because we had seen this experience of countries which had been highly protected, like Korea, or like Chile, or like New Zealand, which liberalized and just went gangbusters. And so there's probably more to it. And so what we did in that study of the big number was to look at all the mechanisms by which trade increases well-being in countries. And there are several of them. Comparative advantage is certainly there, but others, and some I'd studied earlier in my career, economies of scale are very important. But a very important one, which was had not been noticed enough, is that when you get competition from imports, your own firms do better. And that's a big thing. I mean, it stirs them up. Now, the example in this country was, of course, the auto industry and the steel industries.
Sure.
They both got a big impact, and they really improved their own productivity a lot. And then we're going increasingly to a knowledge economy, and research is very expensive. When you take a firm like Apple, what are its costs? Well, half its costs at least are research. Now, if it can spread that research over a world market, as opposed to over just the U.S. market by selling iPhones all over, why, that's a terrific gain. So we tried to quantify all these things and put them together, and the number turned out to be pretty big.
You know, one of the things about economics is that some precepts of economics, basic tenets, are kind of counterintuitive to the average person.
Sure.
So the Trump appeal of, gee, it's better for our country if we have tariffs to prevent goods from coming in. That makes sense at a certain level. It's kind of an intellectual leap for some people to see that, as you just put it, liberalized rules lead to competition, which lead to overall prosperity. But now we're in a period where as compared to the time when you were doing your work, that these ideas are harder for people to understand. What do you think has happened? Why do you think there's been such a change?
Well, I think what's happened in this country, but it's also happened in some of the other advanced countries, is that while we've had globalization, we've also had a huge increase in the technical component of work. And not everybody participates equally in that technical component, all the information technology and so forth. And so what has happened is that the gains in the economy in this country have largely accrued to, let's say, the top quarter. And it's certainly the top 1% have benefited a lot, but just the top quarter. And the average person, or let's say the bottom 40%, hasn't gained very much because they're still relying on what they can do with their hands and fairly, let's say, modest tasks that they could learn, let's say, in a period of 6 months. And those modest tasks are being increasingly replaced by artificial intelligence of one kind or another. Take your ATM machine. I mean, think of the number of bank tellers who have been replaced by ATM machines, and on and on. And so this very large group of people has not had much benefit in the last, let's say, 25 or 30 years. That's true here, but it's also true in England and
most of the advanced countries, right?
Yeah, and so the resentment is focused on something that maybe government can control. And what can control? It can control trade. It's pretty hard to control technology.
Yeah.
You're going to put Bill Gates in prison? It's even ridiculous to think about controlling technology. Some people have suggested ideas like a tax on robots and so on. But that's not going to happen. But trade, you can see that. You can see the stuff coming in. Sometimes it looks like the stuff that you have made at home. And therefore, if we stop importing it, we'll get our jobs back.
Yeah.
Well, that's a very appealing line, very simple line, and that's what's selling today.
Well, you're right, and which is why it's kind of a blow to the Peterson Institute that you're leaving. But you're not going to leave completely.
No.
Although you mentioned earlier that you in your early career went out to New Mexico,
right.
And so life is repeating itself for you, right?
Oh, indeed, yes. I like New Mexico. It's a great state. It's sunny again. And I enjoy living there, so I'll be there, but I will be a non-resident senior fellow, part-time.
And I hope you'll continue to join us on the ramparts from time to time.
I'm sure there'll be ramparts to fight, so
yeah.
It's an exciting challenge.
Will you continue jumping out of airplanes?
Yes. There's a good drop zone down in the little town of Belen, south of Albuquerque, and I expect to pay a visit there, more than one.
Yeah. Well, we'll wish you all the best, Gary. And I personally, I think this interview is an example of why you're so beloved around here. You explain things so clearly and humanely. So I personally have loved working with you over the last several years,
Yeah. And
almost a decade.
yes, likewise.
And before that, as a reporter, getting to know you.
Yeah.
So all the best to you, and thanks for everything you've done for the Peterson Institute.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a great time. A great trip, as they say.